Good evening and welcome. It's Friday and you're tuned into the best in paranormal talk radio. This is Beyond the Darkness. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Thank you for being here with us all week. Got a great show lined up for you tonight. We've got M.L. Behrman joining us. Mike Behrman is the author of Mojave Mysteries, Real Tales of Unknown Creatures, UFOs, Ghosts, Devil Cults, Giants, and Mysterious Murders in the California Desert. It's part of his Desert Paranormal Series, Book 1. Mr. Behrman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Wow, the Mojave, I didn't realize had that much going on. That's another place I'm going to have to never visit. My list continues to grow on a daily basis of creepy places I have no interest in putting myself into.
Well, I don't know if I'd call it creepy. The desert's a fascinating spot because
Right.
just geographically it's so remote and incredibly beautiful, but it's also does have a rich history of everything from, outlaws, Indians, cowboys, right up to modern day UFOs and everything in between.
Well, let me find out a little bit about your background. What got you so interested and involved in the paranormal and looking into these different weird topics?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the weird and bizarre things, and I've also always been a history buff. And I always loved reading and researching history that might not have been what they were teaching you at school, or at least different versions of
Right.
accepted event. And, excuse me, about 30 years ago, I came to the Mojave on a job. I was living in the Midwest, and I came out here. And I just fell in love with it. And at first, it was just the physical beauty. I loved the open spaces, the rocks and hot sunlight and beautiful nights with stars and moonlight. And once I started doing some exploring, I'm a Jeep freak, and also I love backpacking and camping by myself. So I started exploring, and I started finding all sorts of different crazy stuff and different crazy characters, which is, where you get a lot of material too, is when you start talking to local people.
Right.
It seems like everyone's got a story,
Sure.
and the weirder the better for me. And I started keeping files on it, things that I thought were interesting. Some were just, so crazy that I just pass it by. But other stuff that I thought had some historical thing to it, or maybe an explanation outside of what I was hearing. And I just started collecting it all. And I did happen eventually. There's a saying, if you're out in the desert long enough, you will see something.
Right.
And I had a couple experiences that were, I don't want to say paranormal, but they were weird and interesting. And that kind of got me hooked into maybe I'll write a book and share all the stuff I've collected and some of my own stuff. And interesting enough, my own experiences led me to a lot more stories, because someone would hear, oh yeah, I saw something like that too. Or, they'd share a family history or something. And it just kind of snowballed from there. And I did the book, and I want to do it in a series because the Mojave is so vast. The first one I'm dealing with California, Death Valley, Mojave Preserve, Joshua Tree, those areas. And then I want to move, Arizona and Nevada in future volumes.
What type of experiences have you had that you would put into the realm of the paranormal?
Well, I had two, I hate to use the word UFO, but that's what they are, and,
Right.
and that I couldn't identify it. You want me to give you the full story?
Yeah, we've got a great show to fill here, Mike. I'd love to hear what your story is. Don't be a tease, man. We need to know.
No problem. Well, okay. About 5 years ago, I was down in these canyons out in the San Bernardinos, and it was just about midnight. It was a full moon, and the canyon I was in was really deep. The walls were very steep, meaning when I looked up, I could only see maybe 30-40% of the sky before the canyon walls on either side cut it off. And I had stopped to relieve myself, and I was standing there, and I happened to look up, and over my left shoulder, I saw this glowing yellow ball come floating over the opening of the canyon and cross over on top of me and disappear behind the other wall. Now, a couple things. It was moving slow enough that I could extend my arm and stick my thumb up to measure it, and it was about the size of my thumbnail, if I was holding it at length.
Right.
And it was moving against the wind, and it wasn't making any sound at all, and it was really bright gold. Now, I should say real quick, out here in the desert, one of the things we find all the time are these damn Mylar balloons that people release for birthday parties or whatever, and being a reflective thing, you see those all over. So at first I thought that's what it was, but then when I'm like, well, it's moving against the wind, so it couldn't be drifting. So it struck me as really weird. Excuse me. So I jumped back in the Jeep, and it took me about an hour to get up out of the canyons up to a flat area where I could stop and get out my binoculars and search around. And sure enough, I saw it come out from another peak, continuing on its way. It was going due west. And I was able to put the binoculars on it. And when I first looked at it through the binoculars, it was gold, but it was had like a staticky discharge to it with these little like gold sparkles dropping off of it kind of in a trail.
Okay.
And I was like, wow, that's really weird. It almost reminded me of like a plasma ball. And I wondered if I was looking at some sort of discharge or ball lightning or something like that, because it was a super still night. It was in July, so it was really hot. I think it was about 100 degrees even then. And all of a sudden it stopped, and it started turning colors. And what was interesting is if you look through the naked eye, you could tell it would turn like a whitish, then a red, then a blue, then back to gold. And but when you put the binoculars on it, you could actually see it looked iridescent, and the colors would wash over it as it changed, almost like if you poured dye in a glass of water,
right,
and you see it would do that, and then the color would come on full and cover it, and the light would change, and then it would go back to whatever the next was in the cycle. And I sat out there for probably a good 40 minutes watching it, and it just did that, but then it started to rise slightly, and as it rose, it started to get very translucent, and by the time it had rose maybe 15 degrees off the horizon, it just faded out, and that was the last I saw of it. So, that, I don't want to, like I say, a UFO, spaceship, aliens, because it always struck me as I was looking at some sort of natural phenomenon or light inversion or something that was just really weird. So that was the first thing that happened. And then a couple of years later, now I also love, when I'm out, I love looking for satellites. And in the desert, because the sky is so clear at night and there's so little light pollution, you can actually see satellites crossing overhead. You can see the space station. You can see all sorts of things. And I even have an app on my phone, which anyone can get, that shows like what time certain ones come over, where they're headed. Right. So I was out one night and had my binoculars. I was just laying on a rock watching the sky, and I was scanning around with the binoculars, and all of a sudden I saw three small lights on the horizon in a triangular formation, and they were coming right directly overhead. And as it got closer, I could see that it wasn't a solid object. It was three lights in a triangle, because I could see the stars behind them as they moved across the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know there's a French mapping satellite system that travels in a geosynchronous orbit in a diamond formation. So that's what I thought it was at first. I'm like, oh, wow, there's those French satellites. And I was watching them, and all of a sudden, the lead one kept going straight, but the one to the right of it all of a sudden did a perfect button hook turn and started going back towards where the horizon had come from, at the same speed. And then the other one on the other flank dropped and started doing this weird, like, pendulum falling leaf pattern that got bigger and bigger and bigger. And a satellite, it takes about 3.5 minutes to cross the horizon to horizon if they're really moving. And in that 3-minute space, the lead light went in the direction they were heading. It disappeared over the horizon. The one that turned around continued on straight back towards the other horizon. And the one that was falling fell for maybe a couple minutes, and then it winked out. Now, I am familiar with flares and stuff from the military because we get a lot of military aircraft out here. And it wasn't a flare hanging on a parachute or anything. And these lights were very small. They were hard to see with the naked eye. You needed the binoculars. And I was like, okay, that was really weird, because for something to be going that fast and pull a U-turn like that would be a tremendous amount of G-forces on anybody if it was piloted. And I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with satellite technology if there's satellites that can do that. So I put that down to like, okay, well, that was really weird. There's one I can't explain, and that was definitely mechanical, not a physical thing. Now, I use this story to segue into how I get other stories, is that
I'd like to know a little bit more about that, and then I'll hear about this. But so you have this
Sure.
experience, you see this. How do you begin to process it? I mean, I saw something in the skies myself over Trout Lake, Washington. I still cannot wrap my head around, and it's been a decade, and it's still, I can't figure out what it was I saw. What do you do to deal with that? I mean, what do you believe it was?
Well, that's what I'm going to say. For 2 years, I was like, I had no idea. I was like, okay, I saw a powered, structured device execute maneuvers that I don't want to say they're not technologically possible, because obviously they are, because I saw them. But whether that was a military thing or whatever, I didn't know. It's just one of those things where I went like, wow, I finally saw something I can't explain. Because I don't want to say I'm cynical. I'm not cynical. I'm very pragmatic, and I try not to immediately jump to the most crazy or far-fetched theory. But this was one where I was just going like, I have no answer for that. Now, 2 years later, I was talking to a guy about that, because he was telling me something he had encountered. And I got halfway through that story, and he started laughing. And he goes, I know what you saw. And I'm like, oh, really? What? He goes, you saw a drone test, a military drone test. And I go, really? I mean, what was why would one go straight, one turn, and one fall out of the sky? And he goes, well, we're working, apparently his brother works on micro-optics, and the military is developing a whole range of super small drones. Okay. And they do them in what's called swarms. Well, they'll drop 30 drones in a cloud, and they'll all pilot towards whatever they're seeking to destroy or cover or whatever. And he goes, frequently we'll fly them in formation, and when we lose power on one, you'll see that flutter, it fall out of the sky like that. He goes, I'm almost certain what you saw was a drone test.
Interesting.
So, yeah. So at this point, if you were to ask me, well, what was it? More than likely it was a drone test, but unless I, saw the drone land at my feet, I couldn't tell you exactly.
Right. There's still that,
but the first
that
one,
question
the glowing,
of what is it? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. then just by way of segue, then he told me some stories that he had encountered and his brother working for the military on these things on other stuff. So that kind of became the impetus for a lot of me doing the book. I was like, wow, once I started telling people about stuff, they would tell me their stuff, and I would hear even more incredible things. And
well, when they started saying that, they're like, oh, well, that was just drones. Don't worry about it. But let me tell you the real story. Would they go into seeing something that they couldn't explain?
What he told me about was something I chronicled in the book was the 2008 Needles crash, which in UFO folklore, the story is that in 2008 in Needles, California, which is right on the border of the Mojave and Arizona, an object crashed in the desert. Some people saw it, and about 18 hours later, a fleet of helicopters came in from the direction of what would be Las Vegas, which is Area 51's takeoff point. With helicopters that slung something under a lifting copter and took it away. And, some people said it was a UFO. Some people said it was a satellite, foreign satellite they had grabbed. And then others said it was a drone. Now, he told me it was no drone because we don't fly drones that are the size of this thing. And he said he didn't know what it was, but he was in the area at the time working with his brother on another test. And he said that the guys that came and retrieved it were outside of their units and cordoned off everything and made people wait, until the choppers had cleared the area, and then they let people back through this remote area they were in. So he said, if it wasn't a satellite, then what was it? But he couldn't say one way or the other. But he said it was definitely something that alerted the recovery teams.
How very secretive. He could not confirm nor deny what it was that fell from the sky.
Yeah. Well, that's the maddening thing about so many stuff when you deal with the military or official responses is you, at some point you run into that and you don't know if that's just, you're being put off or they actually have something that they don't want to share with you.
Now, have any military or ex-military come to you off the record without giving their names or, wanting to be recorded for this, but have they told you stories of craft that they do believe is alien in nature?
And I have not encountered any military guys that have talked to me about any UFO stuff. What they did talk to me about was some black helicopters that we had seen in the area of Joshua Tree and in the park, as a matter of fact. And helicopters, one, military is not supposed to fly through the park. Two, they're not supposed to go below 500 feet. And I was out there one night, and I saw a stealth chopper, like they used on the Bin Laden raid,
right?
Come overhead at about 50 feet, totally blacked out, and zoomed through the valley and up over the mountains where I was. And they told me, they're not supposed to do it, but they were running recon teams in the park, and the object was you don't want to get caught by the rangers. So that was their war game they were running. So they said they were dropping recon teams and picking them up, and that was not supposed to be happening. But that was pure conventional battlefield technologies, stuff we do today, running forward observer teams in and stuff like that.
What are
no one had.
Yeah, go ahead.
No one had ever told me that they knew there was a UFO being held somewhere.
What are some of the most, just insane UFO stories and encounters that you collected for this book?
Well, one that I thought was really scary was from an older woman's daughter. They lived in Death Valley, and the mother would make a trip down from Death Valley to Baker, which is a small town on the 15, which is the major highway through that area. And it's about a 3.5-hour drive down a long dirt road and really remote area. And she said that one night her mother said she was going down to visit her sister and get some groceries in town, and she was heading down the road, and she saw a flashing light way in the distance, which she thought might have been a sheriff or something. Now, these roads don't really get patrolled by sheriffs or rangers that much, so to even see a light would be interesting. And she said that's what she thought it was at first, was a sheriff's car way down there that might have been an accident or something. As she got closer, it was really bright, flashing red and white in sequence. And as she got even closer, her car started to stutter and stall. And eventually it did stall, and she coasted to a stop. And she said the light in front of her on the road was so bright she couldn't really see much past maybe 60 yards in front of the car, and she said she saw what looked like a shadow of someone walking towards her, which she thought was a sheriff's officer that might have been coming up to warn her away or something. And she said she was watching that shadow come towards her, and all of a sudden she became aware that someone was standing right at the side of her car, right at the door. And she turned and looked, and there was another dark, tall shadow she could only see from the shoulders down. And she said all of a sudden he put his hand up to the window, and the window, the underneath of the hand looked like, she said it looked like a lizard's belly, kind of beaded and scaly. And he put his hand on the window, and she said the window started to vibrate really quickly. And all of a sudden she passed out. She thought she was going to have a heart attack. She was so scared. But then the minute the window started vibrating, she passed out. She woke up about an hour later, as far as she could tell, and the light was gone. Her lights were still on. The road in front of her was empty. No one had come along, which is no surprise out there. And she noticed that her shoes, she had been wearing tennis shoes, and her shoes were on the passenger side seat off of her feet, and that she was dressed, but she said she felt as though she had changed her clothes, like she had rebuttoned her dress or put her stuff back on. And she noticed that she had wet herself, which she assumed was through fear from when she first saw the
right
being standing at her window. And she said that it took her, she was shaking and very shook up, and she was an older woman and very religious, and she always interpreted this as maybe more a demonic thing than a alien UFO thing. But she said she started the car and it started right up, and she kept going, and she said she felt like she was sleepwalking, until she got to her sister's house, and then she broke down, and her sister, all she could tell her sister was that something horrible had happened, and she didn't want to tell her husband. So she said she was sick and stayed with her sister for the rest of the week before she could come home. But the daughter said that the mom only told her this story when she was dying later of breast cancer, and wanted to share it with her before she died. And she said she was, very emotional and crying as she related it. And she, like I say, being very religious, thought of it more in terms of a demonic thing than an alien thing. But from the sounds of it, it's got your classic lost time, aliens stopping cars, taking people out. So, make of it as you will. But to me, that was one of the scariest, because the idea of all of a sudden seeing someone at your driver's window and then seeing that hand.
Are there many abduction stories that come from that area?
I have seen a lot. Like, if you Google it, you'll see all sorts of stories. Now, I try to avoid stuff that had been regurgitated a million times online, and I tried to find people that would actually tell me firsthand things. And of the people I found, this one was really the only what I would term abduction story I heard. I heard a lot of strange lights. One guy who fixed road moving equipment told, I'll tell his story real quick. His job, and this was actually in the late 60s, he was working on a highway thing, and at night he had to work on the tractors and stuff like that to get them ready for the morning. And then, so he'd often be out there late at night. And one night he was out there, and he saw what looked like a giant black triangle come overhead, completely quiet, noiseless, and sailed overhead and go towards the mountains. Now, at the time, he was trying to change the track on a bulldozer, and he was using a big crowbar, metal bar, to try and push the end of the track off the bogey wheels. And he said that all of a sudden it started vibrating in his hand when this thing came overhead, and all of a sudden he got a hell of a static shock off of it. And the thing moved away, and then he said every battery on every tractor was discharged. Everything was dead after that. So he wasn't able to work anymore because he had a battery-powered welder too. And he said that he was packing stuff up, and all of a sudden, sure enough, this thing came back along the same path overhead, and he said it made a deep rumbling sound, and as it did, anything metal around him started to get like St. Elmo's fire. Are you familiar with that term from, static discharge on things? Sailors will see it on the rigging and stuff like that in the old days when they used to go through thunderstorms. And planes sometimes will pick up a discharge along their wings when moving through clouds. So he said he saw the same type thing on the tractor hoods and the fenders and stuff, and then this thing moved off silently, and he said that he was, by the time he could get his truck started, he was ready to go home and pack it in, and he caught hell from the supervisor for not having the stuff ready, and he didn't tell him that, hey, something came overhead and discharged all the batteries. But,
right. Which is frightening, right? That worked like an EMP.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I use it as an example of something to me that has a credibility to it, in that it's really weird, but it's not that fantastic. I mean, it still falls within what scientifically could happen. In that same area, there's another guy, I chronicle his story in the book, who his name was Barry Storm, as his assumed name. His real name is John Clemenson. But he was prospecting out in that area in the 50s, and he claimed that 3 UFOs came overhead and beamed a light down on a hillside to show him where to dig. Just give me a sec here. I just got to... Sorry about that. They beamed this light down, and he went over and dug there, and he actually found a jade deposit. And he started a mine, the Barry Storm Jade Mine, and that mine still exists. And if you Google it, you'll see all sorts of stories of people that went out and talked to him, and all these incredible claims that he made, that, the UFOs would periodically come back and show him where to dig. Now, whether they showed him where to dig or not, the fact is he found something. He actually found something and worked that claim till the end of his life. And you can still go out there and see his mine and the jade deposits and the remains of his old cabin and stuff that had all burned down. But there's a UFO story from the same area that's a little bit more, I don't want to say fantastic, because anything that involves a UFO, I guess, could be termed fantastic. But a little more of the, sci-fi movie type attribute of UFOs as opposed to something, like I said, the construction guy. But these stories are why the desert fascinates me so much. To actually have a mine where a guy said a UFO showed him where to dig, and
right. I mean, that's fascinating, right? That's above and beyond any kind of story you've heard. But again, we've heard many times that the idea could be that aliens are coming here to coal our gold or platinum, and that might be part of their needs.
Yeah, that's quite true. Now, my personal belief is I kind of believe the Arthur C. Clarke theory. Now, Arthur C. Clarke, I don't know if you know, wrote 2001. Right. He was the designer of the first telecommunications satellite, and he was a very forward-thinking scientist. And he said that if aliens are here and doing stuff, their technology is so far in advance of ours that it would appear as magic does to us. The same as if you tried to go to the Amazon and show your iPhone to a tribesman who had never seen, anything outside of the woods. It would seem magical, not technological. So I am always a little leery of the idea of aliens needing to mine here, or, the cattle mutilations where they need some enzyme that only the cattle have. I mean, if you're able to bend time and space, you can synthesize almost any artificial crystalline structure, or, we're just a couple years away from being able to clone stuff off stem cells. So, you wouldn't need to go across the universe looking for something that would be so elemental in the asteroid belt, for instance, or something. Now, that's my personal thoughts.
Well, I'll tell you what. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that like I said, that's my personal thoughts. But, any mystery being a mystery, there could be elements to it that you just don't even see, that you don't understand what they're actually doing.
Well, let's do this. We've got more Mojave mysteries coming our way. Our guest will be here with us, Mike Behrman, as we continue the show. But right now, we're going to dip into the archives as we look at a story, a true encounter. So it's time for Theater of the Mind.
Deep Breath, a true account from Andy Crump. In the summer of 2011, I had the single strangest and most surreal experience of my life. I'd gone boating with a few buddies and our girls off the shores of Malibu, California. The day was perfect. The rhythmic sounds of the waves lapping against our anchored boat, the laughter of friends filled the air, the distant cries of seagulls circling overhead. The sun was hot, the air was cool, and the company was lively. To say we enjoyed an adult beverage or two may be an understatement. Day slowly turned to night, and our floating party was on its second wind. Everyone had perked back up and enjoyed the sunset and all that goes with it. We played some games, and we laughed about those stupid things, and just enjoyed a peaceful night out on the Pacific Ocean. As the night waned on, we noticed a particular whirring sound. It seemed to be everywhere, but nowhere at the same time. We could not find the source of the sound no matter how quiet we got. It was close to 11 at night, and we were going to have to head back in soon before we had a run-in with the Coast Guard for our loud and energy-filled evening. That is when my friend Dane noticed lights under the water, flashing in a strange, nonsensical way. We watched in amazement as the lights began to move beneath the waves of the ocean in a hypnotic dance. Our motley crew grew silent, with only the occasional, "What the hell are we watching?" mumbled among the group. The glowing seemed deep. It was bright, but we could not make out a source. Then the night took a left turn, straight to the twilight zone. All power on the boat just stopped. The lights dimmed. Our motor puttered and then quit altogether. I reached for my cell phone to spread a little light, but found that even our cells were non-responsive. All of our cell phones. The girls began to panic a little bit, and we did our best to comfort them. We were out far from shore, but could still see the lights along the beaches. The whirring was getting louder, and the lights began to circle the boat at breakneck speeds. The lights had been white, but as they circled around us, they seemed to flicker, deep blues and light purples. The water beneath us began to churn, and the waves rocked our mid-sized craft, not enough to capsize us, or even threaten to, but certainly enough to get and keep our attention. I flicked the switch on and off for our emergency onboard radio, but my efforts proved fruitless. Everything on board was dead, and I have to admit, I was thinking we may end up the same. The whirring noise gave way to an electronic humming sound. The water seemed to crackle with energy. I had no idea what was happening, no clue what to do, and we stood there in stunned silence, the air only disturbed by the quiet, gentle cries of some of my friends, as we awaited an uncertain fate. The boat began to rock a bit more violently, and the lights were getting brighter as they appeared to near the surface. If this had been in the air above me, I would have been certain it was a UFO, but at this point, I had never heard of UFOs underwater. We held our breaths collectively as the glowing from beneath and around our boat stopped. The hum slowly faded, and all was peaceful again except for the slightly choppy water they had caused. Then, without warning, we felt something slam the underside of our boat, hard. It shook us good, and our nerves were on edge. We were sure that we were about to get flipped and witness the end of our much too young lives. The boat seemed to vibrate as the thing below us continued to push. That is when the light breached the side of the boat. It was a large orb of brilliant white light. It didn't illuminate much around it, but the light source was intense, and the humming and whirring were replaced with a loud clicking noise. The ball of light just hung there, motionless, as it clicked away at us. Now we were in full-on panic mode. The girls were screaming, the guys were cursing, and we were terrified that this thing was going to sink us. Maybe too many sci-fi movies influenced our fears, but those fears were real. I started to feel an all-too-familiar squeezing in my chest. I was beginning to enter a full-on anxiety-induced asthma attack. I could feel airways closing and my chest heaved, trying to catch a breath. Everyone else was too far busy to notice as they dealt with their fears in their own irrational way. It was dark. I couldn't see well to find my rescue inhaler, and I dropped to my knees, terror gripping me as I faced this light anomaly. It began to pulsate and throb and make a high-pitched squeal, and then it began to slowly move its way towards me. My friends began moving to the far corner of the boat, rightfully so. Everyone was more frightened than they had ever been, and now they were positive that they would be witness to my untimely death. I started to rise, pushing myself with all I had to get up and try to put some distance between myself and it. My knees were shaking, my footing was uneven, and I started to turn my back to the threat in front of me. My body facing my friends, I could see the abject fear in their eyes as they watched me slowly robbed of my breath, and then my body was rocked, like a punch right in the middle of my back. I felt what little air had been left in my straining lungs expel from my mouth with force. I fell to my knees, and then a flash of light right in front of me, and then blackness as I slipped into unconsciousness. I woke up minutes later as my friend shook me, trying to rouse me from near death. The power was back, the boat was moving, and we were making our way inland. I woke with a start and gasped the deepest breath of my life. My breath was restored. Someone must have found my inhaler and gave me a few puffs while I was out of it. That is when they told me they thought I was dead. They said the light ball hit me and passed right through my chest, leaving me a crumpled pile on the deck. And then it dove back into the depths of the ocean, leaving no trace of its visit. As soon as it submerged and vanished, the power to the boat flickered to life, and they scrambled to navigate our way out of this nightmare. When we finally left the boat, they were surprised to see no markings on me or my shirt where I'd been hit. I did some research after our incident, and I found that UFO watchers were often compelled to visit this area and would often claim to see craft above the skies in Malibu and the Pacific Ocean. Some claim they would come from the water and race off through the skies. I also found that other groups meet nearby to summon these craft, calling them forth and photographing them. We have returned to these waters a few times since, and have never had a repeat encounter of anything out of the ordinary. I'll never forget what happened that day. Not that I could forget if I tried, because not only did we see what we saw, experience what we experienced, I was left forever changed that day. As a lifelong asthmatic, I have never had the need or use for my rescue inhaler again. It was like I had never had the affliction. I can't tell you what it was that happened that day. I can only say thank you.
Beyond the darkness.
We're back today. We've got a very interesting show going, Mojave Mysteries, and we've only scraped the surface in the first half. Our guest this evening, Mike Behrman, has opened up his cabinet of curiosities to bring us a very spooky and bizarre collection of true accounts featuring everything from UFOs, unknown creatures, ghosts, hideous murders, demonic cults, and some of the weirdest and most puzzling events ever to come out of the great Mojave Desert. He's back with us now. Mike, thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very much.
Let's dig into some of the weirdest and most puzzling events to come out of the Mojave Desert. What are a couple of your favorites that you cover in the book?
Well, one of the things that always fascinated me was the story of the Yucca Man. Yucca Man, in shorthand, is the desert's version of, I guess you'd say, Bigfoot or an ape man. And the idea that, growing up, I was always fascinated by Bigfoot. I just thought, well, if there is anything like that, it's got to be deep in the Congo or the Indonesian jungle or maybe the Pacific Northwest somewhere. But when I got out here and found that there was a long history of an ape-like creature being seen in the desert, it totally blew me away, because I was like, of all places, desert, you don't think you'd find a hominid or primate or something. But then once I started researching it, I found that there was a long Native American history of a Yucca Man, or they call him everything from the elder brother to the hairy giant, and in some cases the man stealer. And that's not in a romantic way. That's they used to tell their kids that if they weren't good, the Yucca Man would come down out of the mountains and carry them off. Or lone hunters would disappear, and they'd ascribe it to the hairy giant. Now, I actually started running into people that told me that they had seen it or seen traces of it, and then I found that, like I say, that there was a folklore of it within the last 50 years out here, which completely blew me away. And then I myself actually found some prints on two different occasions. One time I found a line of prints. A buddy and I were in Death Valley, and we were hiking out to a Black Rock Canyon, which is a secluded canyon where there's water and old Indian pictographs. And we had to cross about 5 miles of open desert to get to it after leaving the Jeep on a goat trail. So we made it out there, and about a mile out from the canyon, you could see in the ravines in the sand where the animals were coming and going to drink, a bobcat, fox, coyote. And as we got closer, about a mile out, we saw a line of tracks coming up out of a side ravine that looked like human-like tracks. And when we went down and looked at them, they weren't that big. I've got a size 13 foot, so it looked to me like maybe a size 10, but it was very wide in the ball of the foot. And the tracks were about a week and a half old. So in places they were weathered down pretty good, because the wind blows pretty hard out in the desert, and the sand will scrape stuff down real quick. So in some places it just looked like a paddle-like indentation, but in other spots you could see actually a foot with a heel and toes. And what struck us the most is how deep they impressed, because my buddy and I were both big guys. We're over 250 pounds, so our prints would print a lot deeper than the coyotes or a bobcats, and
right.
These prints were equally as deep as us. And we followed these tracks all the way up into the water hole up in the rocks and saw where it had stepped around the rocks, and then after apparently drinking, had gone up, followed the rocks up into the mountains, and returned back where we had come from. And, they weren't so big that you'd go there, that no human could do that, because my footprint was actually bigger. But it was weird, like, who would be out here barefoot in Death Valley in this remote spot? Now, there are still shaman out there practicing the traditional way, so it's not beyond the realm of belief that it could be a solitary human out there. But it was just one of those things where we looked at each other like, wow, that's really weird to find those tracks way out here.
Well, now, and the fact that you're mentioning, these are barefoot tracks. Who would be walking in that area barefoot? I mean, is that a normal? First of all, I would guess the hot sand and desert would be one deterrent. Then you've got every kind of creepy crawler and snake that would be the second and third deterrent for me. Or are there people, indigenous people and people around there that do walk around barefoot?
I can't speak for the indigenous people expertly, but I do know that they did use moccasins for the most part. And really the biggest thing, it's not so much the creepy crawlers, it's the cholla cactus that are the worst things out there, because they're these burrs that have a little fishhook barb on them. And once you get those in you, pulling them out is like ridiculously painful. And I've had to throw away shoes and sleeping bags if it ever got any of the burrs in them, because you just can't get them out. So, yeah. And as far as being hot, yes, we had to cross. It's like a volcanic mineralized rock, and so it almost looks rusty in the sun, and that gets so hot. And by the time we got out there, it was just like crossing an oven. So that's what we thought, too, is like, who the hell's out here walking barefoot? Because, man, my foot couldn't take it, but who knows, maybe if I had been practicing traditional living for 40 years, I could. But that was, yeah. Now, the next one I found was the weirdest thing I have personally found. And I was leading a Jeep drive with some friends, and what we do sometimes is we look on the satellite picture and we plot a path using Google Earth, trying to find a real remote way. And I had plotted this path through these canyons that I thought we could get the Jeeps through. And we got in there, got about halfway, and it started to get narrower and narrower and narrow and rocky. And so I was walking in front of the Jeeps to check the ground and the clearance of the guys behind me. And we finally came to a spot where we couldn't get through anymore. So I was turning everyone around. I circled them around. There's a little open wash. And I stepped back to let the one Jeep turn around in front of me, and I happened to look down, and right next to where I was standing was this print that was absolutely enormous. Like I say, I have a size 13 foot, and I could stick my foot right in it and disappear. It was maybe 18 inches long, and it was so fresh that I got down on my hands and knees and looked at it. And now, when I first came to California, I was trying to work as an animator for Disney. So one of the things we had to study was the walk cycle, which is, how the foot hits and then pushes off and how the leg flexes and all that. So you could draw that. So I was very familiar with the mechanics of a walk. And when I was looking at this print, I could clearly see the heel strike where it come down. We had put the weight down on the ball of the foot and then pushed off with the toes where the sand was pushed up between the toes. And it was still so fresh that the sand was still ridged between the toes. And the whole print was semi-moist in that sand. Now, the size was just incredible. And then the depth of it. I called a friend over and we took pictures of it, and we were actually jumping up and down on the earth next to it, trying to imprint our print as deep as that, and we could not. And my buddy is the world's biggest skeptic, and he's like, if you came and told me you found this, I'd say you're full of crap. He goes, standing here, I got no answer for what that is. And
right.
Now, it shook me up so much that I actually played hooky from work the next day and went back out there by myself and hiked all those canyons trying to find more tracks or anything. And the other thing was there was only that big print and then another one that had been run over by one of the Jeeps behind it. And it wasn't until I stood up on the ridge and looked down at it that I saw whatever it was had picked the narrowest spot in the sand to cross, so it wouldn't leave tracks other than the couple that it needed to step in between these rocks. It obviously followed down this ridge, stepped through there and back up the next ridge and over. And that shows a degree of calculation that's like, wow, that's pretty, clever. And like I say, the size of this thing just blew me away. Now, here's another example where it led to something else. 2 months later, I was at the saloon getting some dinner, and my buddy who was with me came up to me and goes, hey, that print we found? There's a guy here who wants to talk to you about it. I'm like, yeah, okay, send him over. So this gentleman told me that 20 years earlier, he had been hunting in that exact area. When he had a 2-night encounter with something, he said the first night he was sitting by his fire. He was hunting doves, birds, with a shotgun. And he said he heard, just as it started to get dark, he heard this tremendous roaring and screaming coming from the ridge above him. And he couldn't see what was making the noise, but he said it was loud. He goes, it sounded like someone was tearing a grizzly bear apart. It was just, and so he went to bed, if you could imagine.
Nope, I can't imagine that at all.
They're used to that.
Yeah.
And he was armed, and he was in his tent, and he said at about 4 a.m, he heard the springs on his truck all of a sudden creak really hard, like something had stepped up on the bumper to look in the back. Because he said I could hear the chassis creak and squeak back and forth. And I had food and stuff in the back of the truck. And he goes, I was in the tent, so I couldn't see out. And he goes, I just had this overwhelming feeling like, don't unzip the door right now. Just stay real quiet. And he goes, I heard it step off the truck and take 2 steps towards the tent. And he goes, I could tell it was standing there looking at the tent. He goes, because I could hear this low, like real low breathing. And he goes, I could almost hear it like rocking back and forth on its feet, like trying to decide, like, do I go forward? Do I go, am I go look in this tent? What is this thing? And he said he just froze there. And then all of a sudden, he decided to yell out that, hey, I have a gun, I'll shoot, blah, blah, blah. And he said as soon as he did that, he heard the tracks take off and run back up through the canyon behind him. And he got out of the tent, got his flashlight, and he saw tracks just like I described going away from the truck and back up into the canyon. So he goes, whatever that track you found, I had whatever it was, I ran into it 20 years ago in that same area.
That's remarkable.
Now, here's the thing.
Right.
Just over the ridge from that area are some Indian pictographs that they think are between 300 and 600 years old of what they call the Yucca Man, which is this big, hairy creature. And there's an actual, on the boulder, there he is, drawn, with pigment from crushed plants, what I believe it's the Serrano tribe, considers, the elder brother, the older inhabitant of the desert. And if you told, I'm a full believer in evolutionary science and very practical. And, the idea of an undiscovered hominid in the desert at this day and age just seems so fantastic that, sitting on a couch, if you told me this story, I'd go, yeah, you probably saw a bear track or, something. But having seen it myself with friends who, when you look at each other and go, what the hell is this, and then you find some guy out of the blue comes and tells you a story where he, in the same area, it makes you go like, wow, this is really weird. This is a true mystery. If I had to sit down in court and swear to something as being something I witnessed and was really mind blowing, that would probably be one of the most. The idea that there's this being, a creature, or whatever you want to call it, running around out there. And in different areas, it has different names depending on what it's seen around. In the desert, a little bit north of there, it's called the cement monster. And I just did an episode of this on my YouTube channel.
The cement monster.
The cement monster.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, when you hear that, you go, okay, could you think of a more lame name? And
right.
It sounds like a really bad 50s B-movie drive-in special. But no, what it is, there was an old abandoned cement factory near the highway that it was seen around, and locals used to dump garbage out there all the time, and it was seen rummaging through the garbage and leaving these huge tracks, and reports of several people who saw it crossing the road, or as I detailed in the episode, people that lived in some of the outlying trailers said that something approached their trailer and would be peeping in the windows sometimes, and they'd see it, or their dogs would chase something. And now we do get black bears in this part of the desert, but they're very small. And a lot of these people, when I talk to them, they're like, this was no damn bear because I saw it, in the flashlight headlights or in my headlights. It had elbows. It was running. It looked like a huge muscled human, except covered with hair and with a face like, I guess, what they would describe as Homo erectus at this point. So, Yucca Man, the cement monster, elder brother, hairy giant, all seem to be pointing towards some sort of common.
Yes, they're all the commonality is that I don't want to run into any of them.
Yeah, well, here's the thing: he's never hurt anyone, and people that have gotten very close say that all it did was scream at him and then run off real quick. So
it's like my 3-year-old nephew.
Very hostile, which
right.
That's the thing. If it was hostile, someone would have shot it by now, because people out here shoot every road sign and power box they can find. So why wouldn't they shoot at a 7-foot hairy creature that's bearing down on them?
Well, let's talk about some of these devil cults. That is something that fascinates me, as we do true crime every week on our True Crime Tuesday show. I from what I've heard, a lot of these quote unquote devil cults were nothing more than some gothy kids from time to time doing something stupid, but that there's really no call for a real devil cult.
Yeah. Now, I once was exploring an old cabin, and I found someone had crucified a crow on the wall and painted a pentagram around it and all this devil stuff and horrible misogynist curses against women and stuff. Now, that was obviously local idiots being kids, cruel and stupid. Now, you've got, if you want to talk about a cult, we had Charles Manson and the Manson family up at the Barker Ranch in Death Valley. And though they weren't a devil cult per se, they were definitely a cult that was responsible for murders that even to this day, they still wonder if there's bodies out there. And
right.
I'm going to deal with that in a later thing. But, one of the stories I heard, and this one's become kind of controversial, out here, we've got a lot of undocumented workers, and one guy who worked for the lawn crew of another guy I knew told me a story about how he was hitchhiking through Death Valley, down from Sandy Valley down to Baker, and he was it was about a 2-day hike through the hottest part of the desert in July, which is just like insane to try that. And he was hitchhiking. He hadn't seen anything all day, and along comes a pickup truck that two women were in. He thought it was a mother and daughter, and they offered to give him a ride. And, you know, like any guy, immediately he's like, oh, wow, I'm being taken home by two women. They offered to take him to their cabin or a trailer they had to feed him before taking him on the rest of the way. And he went to the cabin, and they made up a plate of beans and hot dogs and some lemonade. And he said the last thing he remembered was taking a drink of the lemonade, and he, you know, keeled over, blacked out. They had drugged him. And when he woke up, he told me this story about how his hands were bound. There was a hood over his head, and he could hear all sorts of people talking and gathering, and vehicles driving up and crunching on the gravel. And all of a sudden, two guys grabbed him and pulled the hood off. And he said, there's these about 15 people naked around a fire, you know, doing this chanting and all this stuff. And he looked on the ground, and he said they had made a huge pentagram with chalk powder. And there was a guy who was all tattooed and pierced with like a monk's outfit, you know, a hooded robe type thing, who seemed to be leading all the festivities. And he said that they made him watch as, he said, at the command of this hooded guys, he goes, everyone started having sex with each other, man, women, didn't matter. And for like 10 minutes, and then he called a halt to it, and then they let out a goat, and the guy pulled out a huge knife and cut the goat's throat and cut it into quarters and through the head at his feet, and had, he thought, signaled to his followers to bring this guy over to sacrifice him or something. You know, he was sure his last minutes had come. Now, this guy had a very heavy accent, so it was very hard making out a lot of this, exactly what he was telling me. But he said that, from what I understand, they said that they had tied his hands in front of him, and they had left his boots on while they were all naked or barefoot. Excuse me. And that the guy started into some chant or I don't know what it would be, incantation or something, waving the knife around and pointing at him. And he thought, you know, now's the time, like, if I don't get out of here, that's going to be me with the goat. And all of a sudden the guy grabbed the heart that he had cut out of the goat and came over and squished it in the poor guy's face as the other two held him down. And he said that, you know, he was sure they were just about to sacrifice him. He said all of a sudden the one girl in the car that had picked him up, the one he thought was the daughter of the mother, he goes, all of a sudden she screamed and fell on the ground and started foaming at the mouth and thrashing around like having some sort of seizure. And he goes, the mother ran over, or who he thought was the mother. He didn't know if they were a couple or whatever. And he said that people turned around just long enough that he kicked the guy next to him as hard as he could and jumped up and took off into the desert. And he said, you know, they started following him, and it was pitch black out, and they're chasing him. He said that their biggest mistake was, one, leaving his boots on, because he could keep going over this rough, jagged rocks and cactus, whereas the guys that were naked trying to follow him, you know, could not follow him. And then he said the other thing was because they had tied his hands in front of him when he fell down, which he did a lot, he was able to push himself up right away and keep going. You know, he wasn't flailing around on the ground. So he was able to distance himself from him in the dark and get away, and he ran, he said, half the night until he got up into these rocks and found a cave where he could still see the flicker of their firelight way on the horizon, but he didn't see any of them. And he spent the night sawing the ropes on a sharp piece of rock and got it cut by morning. And in the morning, when the sun came up, he could see there was no one there, and he came down out of the rocks and continued through the desert trying to get back over to the main road to get down to the highway, but he didn't know if they were going to be looking for him along the road, so he didn't want to walk on the road to leave tracks or to be seen. So he basically followed the road for a whole nother day and slept out that night in the bushes nearby. Didn't see hide or hair of anyone else until he got down to the highway where a trucker picked him up, and he was able to go into town and then call his friends who came and got him and took him back into Los Angeles. And he told me this story and said he was heading back to Mexico because he had quite enough of the Mojave Desert and California and all that. Now, I looked in news reports, archives, stuff like that, see if there's anything along that area that was reported like that. And I didn't see anything in the newspaper and no bodies or anything. Later, I did hear from someone else that supposedly a cabin nearby had been found with 4 human skulls in it that they were investigating. Who knows if that cult was still active or had other victims, or even indeed if they were involved with the other thing. Now, a follow-up to all this is when I published my book on Amazon, you get reviews. And I got a review from one guy who, the only 1-star review I got, and he said, I live on that road. I have the only ranch, and I've never heard of anything like this. So,
maybe he protests too much.
I didn't say anything, because it's like you don't want to argue with people. It's like, okay. I heard it from a guy who barely spoke English, but who wanted to tell me the story in great depth, and his friend translated for the stuff I couldn't understand. And I have heard from other people of crazy stuff out there in Death Valley, and we have had, in the past, Charles Manson and Ballarat Bandit and other people like that. So, there's definitely something going on, whether, particularly in that area, I couldn't swear to it, but it was a damn scary story when the guy told me. I mean, he was pretty shook up still.
Understandably. Listen, we're a paranormal show. I've got to get some ghost stories out of you. Let me hear about a couple of your favorite ghost stories that you cover in the Mojave Mysteries book.
All right. Down in the Dale Mining District, which is down near Joshua Tree, there is a mine called the Virginia Dale Mine. And when people hear a mine, they automatically think of one giant shaft and a bunch of people working like ants in it. And really what a lot of these are clusters of small excavations that they put together under one name and call it a mine. And in 1900, there was a guy, Riley Myers, a young guy, who was working in one of the shafts one day by himself when the rocks collapsed and crushed him. And when they found him, his head and chest were horribly crushed and mangled. He obviously dead. They pulled him out and took his body away. Now, this was 1900. Now, fast forward to 2006. That area is a very popular off-road spot for ATVs, motorcycles, stuff like that. And I started to hear from people stories that they had seen a figure near the one shaft at the Dale Mine, Virginia Dale Mine cluster, that looked to be dressed in work clothes with a white shirt, but who had like blood all over them, the top of their body and their head and stuff, and would stand near the front of the mine. And when people got closer to see if he needed help or something, would run into the mine. And so they'd stop and call down in to see if there was someone who needed help, and there's never any answer or anything. And this happened on more than a few occasions. And one guy who I met, he's into, I don't know the exact term. What is it where they leave a recording device?
Oh, EVP.
It's like a...
Right.
Yeah,
electronic
exactly.
Voice phenomena. Sure.
Right. So he went down into the shaft, and let me tell everyone out there right now, please don't go in these shafts because they are so squirrely. It will only take one bumping an old trestle to bring it down on you. But he went down in there, and about halfway in, the mine actually it drops away to another shaft, so you can't cross to continue. So right there, he left a recorder overnight, and came back the next day and took it home, and he couldn't hear any. He could hear something on it. It sounded like something very low and a rumble, and a couple times he heard like a scratching, which could very well be a rat or some sort of rodent in the tunnel. But he said when he put it on his scopes and slowed it way down, he was able to actually see a pattern of sounds. And when he brought that up, he said it was and I didn't get to hear it because that day I had to go to another appointment, so I did not get to hear it myself. But he said you could hear a low voice that he couldn't tell if it was saying push me or help me or help him. But he said it was very, very low. And now he said the weird thing was when he placed that recorder at the where the shaft dropped off, he goes, if someone had pushed me in, I would have, fallen to the bottom of the shaft and been probably killed. He goes, that's where when you listen on the thing, he goes, the first thing I hear push him sounds right when I placed the recorder. He goes, like they were talking about pushing me in the hole. And right. He said that the other one's about help him or the other term, he said, came later in the evening. His battery, I think it played for about 8 hours. So that one, the Riley Myers ghost of the Dale Mine. Now, since then, it's been seen a couple times, but just recently there was a murder out here where a guy killed his poor girlfriend and threw her down a mine. And the search and rescue visited over 300 shafts looking for her, and a lot of these they boarded up or roped off again to keep people out once they found there was no one in it. So I haven't heard anything about that particular phenomenon, ghost mine, since that, which was 2 years ago. Now, another real quick one, up in Death Valley, there's the Lost Burrow Mine, and it's a gorgeously preserved mine with a huge headstock, which is the framework, where the big wheels used to bring up the ore and stuff like that, or drop the workers down. And all these open shafts. There's a great cabin there and an outhouse there. And people claim that they see orbs near the cabin frequently, which they describe as looking like little glowing soap bubbles that float in a cluster, like in the window and around in the room and then out. And if you try and get close to them, they move off. And some people have tried to take pictures of them. The pictures I saw, you couldn't really tell. You could just see there was something. It looked like dust hanging in the sunlight. It reflects sometimes. And that mine was discovered in 1905 by a guy who lost his burro, and he was chasing it all day, and he finally got mad and picked up a rock to throw at the poor thing. And when he picked up the rock, it was heavy, and he broke it open, and there was gold. And it turns out to be a very, very rich mine. So I started doing some research on it, and I found that the guy that had called in to do the first assessment in 1905 died en route to that mine because he was very sick, and that several other people had died in the mine over the years. And one gal I talked to who claims to be psychic said that she thought that a lot of the orbs that they were seeing were somehow related to the deaths of these workers, and one guy, almost 70, 80, 100 years ago. And another team actually did go into the mine, one of the big ones, and said that they saw orbs, and they also saw what are called ghost light out here. Now, ghost light is what the old-timers used to say, like when there was a uranium deposit or something. Sometimes at night, you could actually see what looked like a glowing fluorescence above the rocks, like a shimmer or something, and they used to look for that. And apparently some people have claimed that in the one shaft, if you go in there, and in any of these shafts, you turn off your light, and it is so dark that you can hold your hand in front of your face and you won't see it. So anything that's glowing or like that just stands out. And so I've heard ghost lights, orbs and stuff from that mine. And then there's a couple others that have your usual night watchman scene, but no watchman is there type thing.
Oh, sure.
The one I liked the best was the Death Valley mine, which is actually in the Mojave Preserve. It's not in Death Valley. But two people, we met a guy who was a caretaker there in the 50s, and he said that even then the one main office was haunted, that they used to see this purple flashing all the time, that if no one was in there, it would look like someone was watching TV or something, because there'd be this like flashing purple light coming out of there. And the thing that they used to see all the time was a big black dog that used to be seen around the porch of the office. And this caretaker from the 50s told us that story, and then these caretakers who were there in the 70s said that they too saw the purple light. They didn't see the dog. And then the best story I have from that is a photographer who a couple years ago, and I have this in the book in an extended version, he was there taking pictures at dusk, and as he was returning to his car, he saw this big thing sitting on the porch of the office building, which still stands. I mean, it's weathered and falling in, and you got to be careful if you walk inside that you don't fall through the floorboards. But he said he thought it was someone sitting there, and then when he looked closer, it was this big black dog, and it looked at him and then trotted off around the side of the building. And then he went to his car. He had a rented car, and he got in the car and it wouldn't start. So he's like, oh, great. Here I am out at this mine in the middle of nowhere, and my car won't start, rented car. And there's not exactly like AAA is going to come out and get you there. So
exactly.
He thought, he's like, okay, I'm going to have to walk back to the main road and down there and see if I can find someone, eventually. But I'm not going to do that at night, especially if there's this wild dog out here, because we do have packs of wild dogs in the desert. They're very dangerous because they're feral and they will attack you. So he got in his car and he figured he'd just sleep for a few hours, and then as soon as the sun was up, he'd hit the road and walk down to the highway if he could make it. And he said that about, midnight, 1 o'clock, he was sitting in the car just looking out. All of a sudden, he looked at the trail in front of him, and there was that big black dog standing in the trail looking at it. And it came closer, and he goes, it's almost like I could tell it could see me through the windshield, even though the car interior was blacked out, and the windows were slightly tinted. He goes, I just had the feeling it was keying in right on me. And he's like, okay, great. Now I got to pee, and there's no way I can get out of this car and do that with this huge dog or whatever it is standing right there.
Right.
And he was watching. Goes, all of a sudden, there was a purple flash of light out of that big office building down from me. And when I say building, it's a wooden structure. There was this purple flashing light real quick, like a flash bulb. He goes, all of a sudden I see the dog turn and look at that building and then turn around and trot over to it and go back up to the porch and then go around the porch to what he assumed was the back of the structure. And he goes, I didn't see that dog the rest of the night. In the morning, I tried the key just one more time, just like, come on, please, please, please. He goes, it started right up. And so he was able to drive out. But he goes, when that light flashed and that dog whipped around and looked at it, he goes, a chill went down my back because it was almost like someone was calling this animal back. It was almost like someone was calling it. And wow. It immediately turned its head and looked and went back to the office.
Great stuff. Very cool. Mojave Mysteries, real tales of unknown creatures, UFOs, ghosts, devil cults, giants, and mysterious murders in the California desert. M.L. Behrman, our guest. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this evening and sharing all these great stories.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for having me.
All right, everybody, that's it for this week. Be kind, love one another. We'll be back with you with a brand new show, brand new supernatural news, and Parashare on Monday. For Tim Dennis, I'm Dave Schrader. You've been listening to the best in paranormal talk radio, brought to you by Audible.com and Amazon.com. Make sure you try that. audibletrial.com/darkness to get your free 30-day subscription and a free downloadable book. And any purchase you make through Amazon.com using our killer deals link at darknessradio.com. Every purchase, a little bit, goes a long way to help keep your buddies alive here on the show. Thank you for being with us. We'll talk to you again next week here on Beyond the Darkness.